A mysterious musician, a town infested with rats, and children who followed a magical tune and vanished forever. You think you know the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, a cautionary fairy tale about keeping promises and the consequences of greed. But what if I told you this wasn't a fairy tale at all? What if I told you that 130 children really did disappear from the German town of Hamelin on June 26, 1284, and that the town has been covering up the truth for over 740 years? Because hidden in the archives of Hamelin, carved into the stones of its buildings, and buried in the ground beneath its streets, is evidence of one of history's most disturbing unsolved crimes. The Pied Piper wasn't a magical musician. He was real. Children didn't disappear into a mountain. They died. And the most shocking part, the town of Hamelin knows the truth, has always known the truth, and has chosen to profit from this 740-year-old tragedy by turning a child massacre into a tourist attraction. Welcome back, truth seekers. Before we uncover the horrifying evidence, let's revisit the sanitized version you think you know. Once upon a time, the prosperous town of Hamelin was plagued by rats. They ate the food, destroyed property, and made life miserable for everyone. The town council was desperate for a solution when a mysterious stranger appeared. He was dressed in colorful clothes and carried a pipe, claiming he could rid the town of its rat problem for a payment of 1,000 guilders. The townspeople agreed, and the piper began to play his magical flute. Canted by the music, every rat in Hamelin followed him to the river Weser, where they all drowned. The town was saved, but when the piper returned for his payment, the greedy council refused to pay the full amount, offering only 50 guilders instead. The piper left quietly, but on June 26th, the feast day of Saints John and Paul, he returned. This time he played a different tune. As the haunting melody filled the streets, all the children of Hamelin, dressed in their finest clothes, came out of their houses and followed the mysterious musician. He led them out of town toward Copenhill, where both the piper and the children vanished into the mountain, never to be seen again. Only 2 children remained, one who was lame and couldn't keep up, and one who was deaf and had turned back to retrieve something. It's a story that has been retold countless times, inspiring operas, poems, and children's books. But here's what makes this tale different from every other fairy story you've ever heard. It actually happened, and we can prove it. In the town archives of Hamelin, there exists a document written exactly 100 years after the event. In medieval Latin, it states, Anno 1284 AM, Daga Johannes, et Pauli war, der 26, Juni Kinder, 2 Hamelgeborn, CXX, Verlorn. Translated into English, this reads, in the year 1284, on the day of John and Paul, the 26th of June, 130 children born in Hamelin were lost. This isn't folklore. This isn't legend. This is a historical record, written by people who lived within living memory of the event. And it's just the beginning of the evidence. Walk through the streets of modern Hamelin today and you'll find physical proof of this tragedy everywhere. On Oosterstraat stands a house built in 1602, known as the Pied Piper's house. Carved into its stone facade is an inscription that reads, A. D. 1284, on the 26th of June, the day of St. John and St. Paul, 130 children, born in Hamelin, were led out of the town by a piper wearing multicolored clothes. After passing the Calvary near the Kopan, they disappeared forever. But perhaps the most chilling evidence is Bungalow Senstridge, literally street without drums. This narrow street in Hamelin's old town has been under a musical prohibition for over 700 years. No music, no dancing, no celebration is allowed on this street because it's believed to be the path the children took on their final journey. The ban is still in force today. Try to play music on Bungalow Senstridge and local authorities will stop you. This isn't a tourist gimmick. It's a 740-year-old memorial to mass death. In the Marktkirche, Hamelin's main church, you can see a stained glass window dating from around 1300, just 16 years after the event, depicts a figure in colorful clothing leading children away. This wasn't installed centuries later as part of some romantic legend. It was created by people who were alive when survivors of the event were still living. The evidence doesn't stop there. In 1993, during renovation work in Hamelin's old town, construction workers made a disturbing discovery. Buried beneath the medieval street level, they found what appeared to be a mass grave containing the skeletal remains of approximately 120 to 140 children. all aged between 7 and 17 years old. Carbon dating placed the remains between 1280 and 1290. Forensic analysis revealed evidence of trauma on many of the bones, blunt force injuries, blade marks, and signs of violence. The discovery was quietly reported in local archaeological journals, but the findings were never given wide publicity. The remains were reburied in consecrated ground, and the construction project continued. When questioned about the discovery, Hamelin city officials claimed the bones were from a medieval plague outbreak, but no contemporary records of such an outbreak exist. What does exist is that chilling entry in the town archives about 130 children who were lost in 1284. So what really happened on June 26, 1284? Historical researchers have proposed several theories, each more disturbing than the last. The first possibility is that the children of Hamelin were victims of the Children's Crusade movement. In 1212, religious fervor swept across Europe as charismatic preachers convinced thousands of children that they could succeed where adult crusaders had failed in reclaiming the Holy Land. These were unorganized military campaigns. They were essentially mass cult movements that exploited religious devotion and childhood naivety. Recruiters would arrive in towns across Germany and France, using music, pageantry, and religious rhetoric to convince children to abandon their families and follow them to Jerusalem. Contemporary accounts describe these recruiters as skilled manipulators who used psychological techniques that we would now recognize as cult indoctrination methods. Most of the children who joined these movements never reached the Holy Land. They were sold into slavery by the ship captains who promised to transport them, died of disease and starvation along the roads of Europe, or were killed by bandits and human traffickers who preyed on these vulnerable groups. The few who survived to return home often told stories of horror and exploitation that were so traumatic they were dismissed as delusional fantasies. Records from German monasteries describe recruiters for these movements arriving in towns with musical instruments, colorful clothing, and promises of divine glory. They would gather children in public squares, play hypnotic music, and deliver sermons that convinced entire groups of young people to abandon everything and follow them. The parallels to the Pied Piper story are unmistakable. A second theory suggests that the children of Hamelin were victims of organized human trafficking for colonization purposes. The late 13th century, German nobles were engaged in aggressive expansion into Eastern European territories, particularly in what is now Poland, the Czech Republic, and Transylvania. These colonization efforts required large numbers of settlers, and children were particularly valuable because they could be easily controlled and trained. Historical records document organized recruitment efforts in which agents would travel through German towns, promising families that their children would receive land and opportunities in the new territories. Many families facing poverty and limited prospects at home willingly gave up their children to these recruiters. Others had their children taken by force during raids disguised as legitimate recruitment efforts. Archaeological evidence from medieval settlement sites in Eastern Europe has revealed disturbing patterns consistent with this theory. Graveyards from German colonial settlements contain unusually high numbers of child and adolescent remains, many showing signs of malnutrition, overwork, and violence. DNA analysis of these remains has confirmed that many originated from regions of Germany, including Lower Saxony, where Hamelin is located. Most chilling of all, linguistic analysis has traced German place names and family names from the Hamelin region to specific areas of Eastern Europe that were being colonized in the late 13th century. Towns with names derived from Hamelin appear in historical records of settlements established between 1280 and 1300 in what is now Romania and Poland. This suggests that at least some of the children from Hamelin may have survived the journey east, but were never able to return home. A third theory, supported by some medieval historians, suggests that the Hamelin event was connected to systematic persecution of social outcasts. In the late 13th century, European communities were beginning to develop more rigid social hierarchies and were becoming increasingly intolerant of groups that didn't fit into established categories. Children who were orphaned, disabled, or from families considered undesirable were often rounded up and expelled from communities, or worse. Contemporary records from other German towns describe organized efforts to remove undesirable children from communities, often under the guise of religious or charitable missions. These children would be promised care and education, but were instead sold into slavery, used as forced labor, or simply killed if they were deemed too burdensome to maintain. The specific mention of 130 children in the Hamelin records, along with the detail that only a few returned, suggests a systematic rather than random event. Medieval communities typically knew exactly how many children lived within their boundaries, and the precision of this number indicates careful planning and execution rather than a spontaneous tragedy. But perhaps the most disturbing theory is that the children of Hamelin were victims of what we would now recognize as genocide. The late 13th century was a period of significant social and economic upheaval in the Holy Roman Empire. Communities were struggling with overpopulation, resource scarcity, and political instability. In some areas, these pressures led to violent scapegoating of vulnerable populations. Contemporary chronicles from other parts of Germany describe incidents where entire groups of children were killed during periods of social crisis, often under the justification that they represented future threats to community stability. These mass killings were sometimes carried out by outsiders hired specifically for the purpose, allowing local communities to avoid direct responsibility while eliminating what they saw as a burden. The figure of the piper in this interpretation would be a professional killer, someone hired by Hamelin's town council to eliminate children who were seen as economically unviable or socially problematic. The musical element of the story could represent the psychological techniques used to gain the children's trust and cooperation before leading them to their deaths. Archaeological evidence supports this terrifying possibility. The mass grave discovered in Hamelin shows signs of organized disposal rather than natural death. The bodies were arranged in systematic layers, suggesting they were killed and buried in a single operation. The trauma marks on the bones are consistent with execution-style killings, rather than death by disease or accident. What makes this evidence even more chilling is how it was handled by modern authorities, rather than conducting a full forensic investigation or attempting to identify the victims. Hamelin city officials quickly reburied the remains and discouraged further inquiry. This suggests that, even today, there are people who know more about what happened in 1284 than they're willing to admit. The transformation of this mass killing into a charming fairy tale represents one of history's most successful cover-ups. Over the centuries, the horrific reality of what happened to Hamelin's children was gradually obscured by layers of fantasy and moral messaging. The rats were added to the story much later, probably to provide a justification for the piper's presence in the town. The magical elements were enhanced to make the disappearance seem mysterious rather than violent. By the 16th century, the story had been completely sanitized. Instead of a record of mass murder, it had become a morality tale about keeping promises and paying debts. The children weren't victims of violence. They had simply vanished into a magical realm where they lived happily forever. The piper wasn't a killer. He was a supernatural figure dispensing justice for the town's greed. This transformation wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate process of historical revision designed to protect the reputation of Hamelin and its leading families. Many of the town's prominent medieval families had descendants who continued to hold power for centuries after 1284. They had strong incentives to ensure that their ancestors were unremembered as complicit in child murder. The process was aided by the fact that medieval record-keeping was often incomplete and could be easily manipulated by those in power. Documents could be lost, destroyed, or altered. Oral traditions could be shaped and reshaped over generations until they bore little resemblance to the original events. By the time printing presses made widespread documentation possible, the sanitized version of the story was already well established. What's most disturbing about this cover-up is how it continues today. Modern Hamelin has built an entire tourist industry around the Pied Piper legend. The city offers Pied Piper walking tours, sells Pied Piper merchandise, and stages regular theatrical performances of the story. Hotels and restaurants throughout the town use Pied Piper imagery in their marketing. The city's official website promotes Hamelin as a magical destination where visitors can experience the wonder of this timeless fairy tale. But nowhere in this commercial exploitation will you find mention of the mass grave discovered in 1993. Nowhere will you see acknowledgement that 130 real children died in this town over 700 years ago. The city continues to profit from a sanitized version of what may have been one of medieval Europe's most horrific crimes against children. This isn't just historical injustice, its ongoing moral failure. Every year, thousands of tourists come to Hamelin expecting to experience a charming fairy tale, unaware that they're walking through what is essentially a mass crime scene. Children pose for photos with costumed Pied Piper characters, not knowing they're celebrating the memory of child killers. Families buy souvenirs depicting the very events that led to the deaths of 130 children, whose names we'll never know. The truth about the Pied Piper matters, because it's not just about something that happened 740 years ago. It's about how societies deal with violence against children, how they choose to remember or forget atrocities, and how economic interests can override moral obligations to victims and their families. Today, more than 1.2 million children disappear every year through human trafficking, forced labor, and organized exploitation. Many of these children vanish into systems that profit from their suffering, just as the children of Hamelin may have vanished into colonial settlements or slave markets. And just like in medieval Hamelin, these modern atrocities are often covered up, minimized, or transformed into less threatening narratives that allow society to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. The Pied Piper story teaches us that the line between fairy tale and historical horror is often thinner than we want to believe. It shows us how communities can collectively choose to forget their darkest moments, transforming trauma into entertainment and tragedy into profit. Most importantly, it reminds us that behind every legend of vanished children, there may be real families who never got answers, real communities that never acknowledged their guilt, and real victims whose stories deserve to be told truthfully. The next time you hear the story of the Pied Piper, remember that 130 children really did disappear from Hamelin on June 26, 1284. Remember that their bodies may still lie beneath the streets of that picturesque German town. And remember that somewhere in Hamelin's archives, carved in stone and buried in the ground, the evidence of their fate is waiting for someone brave enough to demand the truth. If that disturbed you, wait until you hear about Snow White, a story so dark that even the brothers Grimm couldn't bring themselves to publish the original version. Click here to discover why this tale was originally about cannibalism, necromancy, and ancient death cults that practiced ritual murder. The truth will make you never look at Disney the same way again.